Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar featuring the brilliant Michael Doran, a senior fellow and director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East at the Hudson Institute. I'm thrilled to have him joining us today to discuss the Hamas war, both in the context of historical comparisons to the Yom Kippur War, as well as its broader implications in the region going forward. To that end, I highly recommend that you follow all of Mike's work, but in today's context, his recent essay in Mosaic Magazine entitled The Hidden Calculation Behind the Yom Kippur War. And I will be putting that link into the chat for ease of access. It is a must read. I want to share also that as I was reading his essay, I couldn't help but notice a number of parallels between US and Israel policy in 1973 with October 7th and surrounding policies that led to that fateful day. As Mike has pointed out, the Yom Kippur War was also a US-Soviet war with Israel and Egypt serving as battlefield proxies to those superpowers. And I think that's important to keep in mind throughout our discussions, given that today we're dealing with a US-Iran war with multiple proxies serving on Iran's battlefield. So we're going to get right into it. Welcome, Mike, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. And thank you for calling me brilliant.
You are. You've got a lot of words. So, Mike, I'm going to begin with a quote from your essay on the Yom Kippur War. That I included it in the description of today's webinar because you stated something that I thought was important. And you said, it suddenly became clear that Israel's assumptions about its own strength, the character of its enemies, and the fundamental shape of the modern battlefield were erroneous. And then you go on to mention that Israel's prime minister at the time, Golda Meir, she, quote, knew that Sadat wasn't going to go to war. As I've mentioned, I see tremendous parallels in much of your analysis, and we'll be discussing those points. But do you see a similar situation with the events of October 7th and the fact that the Netanyahu government was completely fooled by Hamas, which led it to believe that it had no interest in war? And I mean, was this a failure to have human intelligence on the ground, or is there a broader intelligence failure, or was Hamas just really good at deceiving Israel?
Well, yes, I see a huge parallel, I think everyone does. The Israeli press is full of it, and full of the comparisons, and they're calling it the mechdal, which is the word I discussed in the article that they immediately used to discuss. Mechdal means blunder. I mean, but it really can't be translated because it means a failure to do something that leads to a very costly outcome. So if you leave the fire going on your stove, you have not committed a mechdal. But if you leave a fire on your stove and your house burned down, that's a mechdal. So anyway, they're using that word. That word, if you say ha-mechdal in Hebrew today, it means the 73 war. But they're using it now for this one. And I think it will probably end up changing its meaning to be the 73 war and this one. There's a huge intelligence failure. It's a multi-domain intelligence failure, I think, but it's especially of the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet, the Shabak, has responsibility not just for internal Israel, but also the West Bank and Gaza. They didn't see it coming, but there was a kind of strategic deception. The Gazans, the Hamas, they convinced the Israelis, the Qataris, the Americans, you name it, that they were out of the, at least for the time being, they were out of the mass casualty terrorist attack business, and they were trying to grow the economy of Gaza because they felt pressured by the local population to deliver on good governance, something like that, and everybody bought it to such a degree that is really shocking. Just as everyone believed in 1973 that Sadat could not possibly make war against Israel, so he wouldn't. They never, in both cases, it was a failure to imagine how the opposite party might decide that having a conflict that they couldn't win would work to their advantage.
So you called, you talked about a failure to imagine, and I think in your essay, and you used the term, the concept of operations. So after the obliteration of its enemies' armies in just 6 days during the 67 war, Israel seemingly had an unquestionable military advantage over its Arab neighbors, leading to, I think also, which you've used the term hubris. I don't know if foolishness, naivete would be appropriate, but it resulted in the shock in the opening days of the Yom Kippur War, in which Israel faced massive losses. On October 7th, it seems that Israel underestimated the extent of Hamas's capabilities, notwithstanding their lack of sophistication from a military perspective. I've heard you actually use the analogy of Star Wars and Mad Max. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, concepts of operations for a military intelligence officer it's a difficult thing to focus on because first of all, what is it? Concepts of operations are how a commander in the field uses existing assets that he has, how he puts them together to solve a problem that he has. So it's somewhere between assets and weapon systems and a plan, because it's not necessarily a full-blown plan, but it's putting things together. The great example these days are Iran with its drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles. It puts them all together, and this is actually related to what we're going to be talking about, I mean, to Hamas. It puts them all together in such a way that they can overwhelm any missile defense system in the world. That's a concept of operation. A lot of people still haven't got their head around this, including militaries haven't got their head around this. They know that Iran has a huge missile arsenal. They know Hezbollah has a huge missile arsenal. They know they have drones and so on, but they don't prepare for the packaging all of them together at the same moment. And that's the Hamas used a similar principle on October 7th. They packaged a lot of things together to overwhelm the Israeli censors. And you mentioned Star Wars and Mad Max. That's a comparison, by the way, that I stole. I feel a little bit responsible for plagiarizing here. I stole it from here at the Hudson Institute. We have the really first-rate military analyst named John Kasapoulou. And it's his comparison. He said, the Israelis are living in a Star Wars world, and Hamas is in a Mad Max world, and the world is really Mad Max. It's not Star Wars. The Israelis. I mean, I don't want to belittle them. We don't know the full extent of the mistake yet. I'm sure that we'll have a committee of inquiry and lots of analyses, and it'll be very interesting to find out. But on some level, they started believing that they could prevent attacks on their country by sitting behind a keyboard and using sensors on fences and so on, and it just didn't work. And what Hamas did is they sent different kinds of things simultaneously at the Israelis. The paragliders. If you see one of the pictures, the paragliders are going over the fence at the same time that there's a rocket attack, at the same time that all these guys are breaking through the fence. So you think if you're I can't remember if we talked about this on a previous webinar. If you're the guy on the ground in the first military outpost, and you've got a minute or 2 minutes to phone your commander, and tell him what you're seeing and what's coming at you. You're confused because all these different things are coming at the same time. But Hamas also blinded the Israelis by understanding how they observed Gaza, and they took out the sensors. Hezbollah is doing a similar thing in the north, by the way. I think they learned it from Hezbollah, and the Israelis had a failure of imagination. They never imagined that all of these things could be combined together in this way to produce this effect. Hamas didn't throw any weapon system or tactic at the Israelis that the Israelis were unaware of. what they were unprepared for was the lethal combination of these things. That's concepts of operations.
Great. That's very helpful to understanding, in part what happened and how it happened. I mean, I think people like me, we just assume that Israel's war room has practiced this a million times, and maybe that's the success of, hopefully, God willing, what we're seeing in Gaza explains that. But the shock of the actual attack, I think, was something that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we can see. I mean, it's very. What can I say? It restores your, I think we were all shaken after October 7th. And one of the things that most shook me was not just that Hamas had broken through, but that they went and they held territory for really 2 days. I mean, they were in Sderot for 2 days, and the Israeli counterattack was so slow, and I still don't. That's the thing that I'm most confused by. I've asked a number of Israelis, and they say, "Don't ask, don't hit." Like, don't. So that some will blame Bibi, and they say because everybody was in the West Bank because of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and stuff. But that doesn't explain it. The West Bank is not that far away from Sderot. So why, how come we didn't have a huge number of troops flooding into the zone right away? I don't understand that. And I got worried that that said bad things about Israel's ability to do a land incursion. And then there were a couple of early Hamas videos that came out. I don't know if you remember the one where Hamas is using a pretty simple drone to drop a grenade on a bunch of Israeli soldiers who were standing together. And that was worrying because I was in Azerbaijan in 2020 for the Azerbaijan-Armenia war. And there was video after video after video of the Azerbaijanis doing this to the Armenians, and the Armenians never caught on and dispersed. And I kept watching these videos that the Azerbaijani Ministry of Defense would put out, showing these Armenians all clustered together. And I think, how come these commanders, the Armenian commanders, don't tell their soldiers to disperse? And then, of course, we saw the same thing in Ukraine. So I, who have no military background at all, if you put me in charge of a platoon, the first thing I would tell my men is don't cluster together, especially out in the open. But the Israelis were not ready in some ways, but they clearly now are. I mean, my impression of this war now is it's going extreme as a military operation. Forget about all the politics and everything else. As a military operation, it's going extremely well. And all of the things that we were worried about, we don't have to be worried about. I'm reminded in the 73 war that Dado, Elazar, the chief of staff at the time, I quote him in the article. He calls Golda and he says, "Golda, he says, don't worry." So I think it's on October 14th of 73. He says, "Don't worry. The Arabs are back to being the Arabs, and we're back to being ourselves, and so everything is going to be fine."
I love that that's your takeaway, and that's the way to look at it going forward. But so in addition to the con ops that we've talked about and the failure in that regard, the other issue that Golda Meir faced at the time was the constraints placed on Israel by America. And you've recognized Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger as, quote, the greatest supporters of Israel that have ever run American foreign policy. But I'm not sure that Israelis or American Jews would agree with you, given the fact that although Israel received intelligence that an attack was imminent, Kissinger personally instructed Meir not to preemptively strike, which ultimately led to more Israeli deaths than may have occurred if Israel had begun the war as a defensive one. I understand there were reasons for the U.S. to take that posture, but as you also point out, I'm going to quote you again, the difference between American and Soviet policy was stark. Whereas Moscow armed its allies to the teeth and then stepped out of their way, Washington was tying the hands of its ally as it was about to be assaulted. Can you discuss what preemption meant in October of 73 and what the implications of Biden's demand that Israel not preemptively strike Hezbollah means today? And we're going to get into resupply shortly, but there's a lot of people who wanted to see Israel knock out Hezbollah's weapons to the extent possible. and Biden's holding Israel back from that.
Well, yeah, I don't think these are exactly comparable. So let me see. I'm trying to think. Well, while I'm speaking, I'm trying to think about how to put this together. Let me just start by explaining why I think Nixon and Kissinger deserve to be the best, really the most supportive president and the most supportive administration ever, even more supportive than Trump, who because first of all, there's this issue of the qualitative military edge, which we all take for granted now as part of just a mainstay of U.S.-Israeli relations. The qualitative military edge being the guarantee that the United States gives to Israel. Now it's enshrined in law that that Israel should have a qualitative military edge over any conceivable coalition of states that would want to attack us. That is a legacy of Nixon and Kissinger, and it's a legacy of Nixon and Kissinger in 1970. And the other thing is they guaranteed Israel as well that the United States would not force Israel to withdraw without getting first from territories occupied in 1967, without first getting a peace agreement, a full-blown peace agreement from the opposite parties in face-to-face negotiations between Israel and the opposite party. All this is quite a big deal because up till 1967, I mean, what the Israelis were worried about from until 1970 was a repeat of a repeat of the Eisenhower policy of 1957, when Eisenhower forced the Israelis out of Sinai after they had taken it in 56, basically without any concessions from Nasser at all. And they did that they didn't get any promises from Nasser. The United States didn't get any promises from Nasser, and Nasser gave no promises to the Israelis, and the Americans rolled them out on the principle that the United States couldn't be seen to be backing Israel in any kind of territorial expansionism. Now, we all take for granted that Resolution 242, UN Resolution 242, after the '67 war, is land for peace. We all take that for granted to mean peace arrived at through bilateral negotiations between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, or Lebanon. But that definition only came in 1970 under Nixon and Kissinger. That's a huge, big deal. I'm going on and on here. There's the issue. The thing that I learned in researching for this article was the importance of the War of Attrition in 1970. I used to teach the Arab-Israeli conflict at university, and when I taught it, I would teach a week on the '67 war and then a week on '73, and I would just kind of wave high at the War of Attrition, which I always treated as kind of border skirmishing, kind of like what the Hezbollah Israel war is right now. That's how if we just had that, that's how I kind of saw the War of Attrition. And as I went to do this article, I realized, wow, the War of Attrition was actually an incredibly important event. And it plays no role it ends in a stalemate. And I think I would say defeat of Egypt, really, but stalemate. There's no change in the status quo at all. But the Egyptians opened it up, started the war, which took place all along the canal. They started it in order to change the status quo. So then they stopped it without having achieved what they started. So I think it's a failure on their part. But the interesting thing about it is it's a Soviet-Israeli war. I was going to say it plays no role in anyone's in the popular memory of either the Egyptians or the Israelis because it ends in a stalemate, and everyone has kind of forgotten it. But it was enormously important at the time because it's a Soviet-Israeli war, and there was this threat of escalation with the Soviets, which convinced the Americans to just shut it down as a stalemate, because they didn't want it to escalate, because they were afraid it would escalate to a Soviet-American war. And so they shut it down. And then in return for the Israelis accepting the ceasefire, the Nixon administration gave the Israelis QME plus the favorable definition of what 242 was. And then behind that was this Nixon-Kissinger idea that they could use Israeli military power to force the Egyptians into a peace agreement with Israel. The two things that I love about the Nixon administration are, one, the recognition of Israeli military power as an asset to the United States, because the idea is to pull Egypt away from the Soviet Union to the United States, and they see Israel as a full party in that. Secondly, that strategy worked as far as I'm concerned. It delivered peace from Egypt, which is still holding up today, 50 years later. So we've had 50 years of no shots fired from Egypt into Israel in anger. That's an unbelievable achievement. All of the things that Nixon and Kissinger are accused of in terms of restraining Israel, I believe some of them are not so true. Others have mitigating circumstances, such as the one you mentioned, that the administration is telling. The administration told, Kissinger told Golda not to preempt. Kissinger believed, just like the Israelis believed, when they got word that Sadat and Assad were about to attack Israel, everyone believed that this was going to be a very short war and that Israel was going to triumph. So the fear that Nixon and Kissinger had was that there was going to be another 1967 moment. The Israelis were going to trounce the Egyptians, take more territory, weaken the Egyptian regime, and then there would be nobody to make peace with on the other side. That would just push the other side to the Soviet Union, and the Soviets would then come in and escalate. That's the scenario they had in their heads, because they had lived through it in 1970. It wasn't this kind of the kind of thing that we see with I believe we're seeing now with the Biden administration, that we know from Obama and that we've seen with Jimmy Carter and Eisenhower, lots of other American presidents who don't want to have any association with Israeli power because they think it somehow taints the United States. So Nixon and Kissinger, yes, they restrained Israel at certain moments, but I think in context, it's not as it's not as an indictment of them as I think it would be in the indictment of others in a different context, because they did see Israel as an asset for the United States, and because their strategy was successful and it brought great benefits for the United States and for Israel. The comparison in today's war, as you suggested, would be for the United States to see Israel as an asset against Iran. Iran and its network is the analog to the Soviet Union in 1973, and the United States should see Israel as its asset in fighting that complex. That complex being Iran and it's what it calls its resistance axis: Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, all these militias that Iran has created in Syria and Iraq, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. should see that as a threat to the United States, and it should see Israel as its asset there. I don't think the Biden administration is there at all. It's defining this policy, this war, as a bilateral war between Hamas and Israel. It's supporting Israel in that. That's great. But what's lacking is that larger conception of how Israel is an asset against the strategic rival of the United States.
And I'm going to quote you where you said that to be pro-Israel is to have a vision of the regional system that regards Israel as an asset, and that clearly defines the respective roles of Israel and the United States in maintaining that system. And I'm glad you went on to talk about that.
You said it. You quoted me. I said it very concisely there. What took me 10 minutes to say here.
No. Because look, you added a lot of history there also, which is I think critically important. Why I called you brilliant, Mike, because I'm always learning from you. So I I actually was asked by a politician many, many years ago to write a paper, white paper on why Israel is a strategic asset to the U.S. And I would only hope that I wish that the Biden administration, who is currently in power during this horrific time, understood that. And then, so you've brought Iran into this, and the fact that this is a war with Iran, I think, moves us in a different direction from the Yom Kippur War. So Sadat's goals in launching the war with Israel were quite different than Hamas's goals in committing the atrocities of October 7th. And perhaps you can touch on that. But can you also discuss how U.S. appeasement of the Islamic Republic led to October 7th and explain to the audience Israel's failure to recognize the broader implications of the U.S. appeasement strategy from its national security and military strategic perspective? As it seems that, and circling back to the quote from your essay that I read at the beginning, Israel's assumptions with regard to Iran have been fatally flawed for quite some time.
Yeah, totally. Let's take it point by point. The first one is that there's no comparison between Sadat and Hamas. There's no comparison at all. Well, there's a comparison in the sense that that Hamas believed, like Sadat and the Iranians, Hezbollah, Hamas, now they all believe that they can bring pressure to bear on the United States, and the United States will come in and it will shut Israel down. Because that's what happened for those who have forgotten their history. That is what happened in the 73 war. Is that what the superpowers came in, the Americans and the Soviet Union, and to avoid escalation between them, they shut the war down. Kissinger managed it so that that Israel had the advantage when the war ended. Israel had encircled the Egyptian Third Army, and if it had been given a few more days, it would have annihilated it. And then the road to Cairo would have been totally open to the Israelis. Not that they would have had known what to do in Cairo once they got there, but there would have been no Egyptian army in between. The Americans were afraid, and I think it was a sensible fear that this was going to lead to a real Soviet-American clash. Again, they were afraid of that on the basis of their recent experience in 1970 with the War of Attrition. But Sadat heated up the conflict in order to bring the superpowers in order to get a peace process going so that he could get out of the Arab-Israeli conflict entirely, say goodbye to pan-Arabism for once and for all. That's a slight exaggeration. He was trying to hold together the pan-Arab coalition as long as possible, and if American policy had allowed him to do that, he would have held it together, as long as possible. Why would he give up those assets? But he was willing. He wanted a peace agreement to get out of the conflict. Hamas is all about destroying Israel. That's all they want to do. There's anyone who's out there. There are lots of them here in this town in Washington who are arguing that Hamas has accepted Israel, and there are lots of people on the university campuses just mouthing propaganda, saying that Hamas is the representation of the Palestinian desire. It's the angry representation of the Palestinian desire for a two-state solution. It's hogwash. I mean, you read basic statements of Hamas. They don't hide who they are, and those atrocities on October 7th, those were not a call for a two-state solution. Those sent a very clear message. They're burning of babies, killing babies and the young kids in the arms of their parents, and so on. That's a way of saying that we want to annihilate you, and that was the policy, and it was designed to send that message. So there's no comparison there. But there is a comparison in terms of the tactic. Hamas is clearly counting on the United States to come in and shut this war down. And I think there's still a danger of that. And I think we should all be saying, no ceasefire. Israel should be, we should back Israel to the hilt until it successfully fulfills its war aims, of making sure that Hamas cannot make war on Israel and that it cannot rule the Gaza Strip anymore. And then I tend to agree with you. I don't want to say it too loudly because I feel a little bit sheepish about saying, let's make the war bigger. But let's just put it this way. Israel is not going to have security, the minimum security that it needs until Hezbollah is taken care of. And by taking care of, that doesn't mean necessarily dismantling all of it, because the war with Hezbollah is going to be not like 2006. I was in the White House for that. It's going to be very ugly. Hezbollah now has 200,000 rockets and missiles, many of which are precision guided. They have payloads that are much bigger than anything that Hamas has. They have the ability to overwhelm Iron Dome, David Sling. So Israeli civilians are going to die, and Lebanese civilians are going to die in even greater numbers. So it's going to be a very ugly war. But if this ends now, today, then the balance will have changed considerably between Israel and Hezbollah, because Israel has depopulated the south, and it is evacuated population from the south. It's evacuated population from the north. They're not going to be able to, in the south, they're not going to be able to repopulate the Negev, or the lower Negev, whatever you call that part of the Negev, until the people living there are guaranteed that they're not going to be subject to attacks by Nazis, like just happened. The same thing is true in the north. The north has been evacuated, and if Hezbollah, what it wants is to end this war with the rules of engagement going back to where they were in 2006, where Hezbollah can just turn up the rheostat and heat up the border whenever it wants. If that happens, then Jews and even just civilians of all of ethno-religious stripe are not going to go back to the northern border area. That is intolerable for any country. It's not so. So the balance of power has to change in the north. It has to. I think that's got to be the minimum war aims of the Israelis and of the Americans.
Well, I mean, Biden pulled up warships to make Israel feel comfortable. Don't do anything. We've got your back. But
that's a bear hug. The bear hug policy, where they squeeze Israel tight, and then they turn to the Zionist Americans and to the Israelis, and they say, "Oh, look how I'm kissing Israel. I love it. I love it." But then they turn to the progressives on the college campuses and to the Iranians, and they say, "Look how I'm restraining Israel. Look how I'm restraining Israel."
Well, they're not only restraining Israel, they're restraining themselves. And there was actually a New York Times report yesterday that Biden has rejected more aggressive bombing options proposed by the Pentagon out of fear of provoking a wider conflict with Iran. And if that's the case, which, doesn't surprise you or I mean, I feel like I'm watching Animal House with Kevin Bacon's character, bending over.
Thank you, sir. Can I have another? Right.
I mean, how many U.S. servicemen are going to be injured before the Biden administration stops fearing Iran? What are your thoughts on that? And what does this mean for Israel that Biden is so fearful of provoking a wider conflict with Iran?
Well, yes, you actually asked that in a previous question, and I never got to it. Yes, I mean, we have to admit now a couple of things about the Biden policy. Number one, it's not simply about the nuclear program, but there is it's an appeasement policy across the board. We've appeased them on the nuclear program, and we are buying quiet on the nuclear program by all of this sanctions waivers, and turning a blind eye to oil sales to China, putting billions of dollars in the pocket of the Iranians. There's a new waiver out. News of a new waiver out today. I saw in Washington Free Beacon. The policy continues. There's no doubt in my mind that that's part of the essential context in which this war unfolded, and in which Hamas And Iran and Hezbollah all believe that it is possible to attack Israel with impunity, without fear that the United States is going to retaliate in any way, and attack the United States with impunity, which we've had over, I don't know if it's over, but we've had 50, nearly, if not 50, then just under 50 attacks, with dozens of Americans hurt. And
Since October 7th.
since
Before
October,
that,
yes, and there were 83 or so before October 7th, and then 50 some odd since October 7th. It's crazy, and it's barely being reported. And for us to be giving waivers at that moment, it sends a message of weakness. It sends a message that we can push the Americans harder in order to bring the Americans to shut the Israelis down. It's no way to run a foreign policy. I can't. It's hard to fathom what goes through the minds of the guys in the White House. But of course, we've been watching this show for a long time. We watched it all through the Obama administration, and we've been watching it through the Biden administration. So I have no problems in saying with confidence that they're not going to give this policy up. They love it. They think it's a good policy.
So we know that Iran's running rings around the U.S., but do you think that they're also doing this to distract from their advancing nuclear program and stuff going on behind the scenes, that all of a sudden we're going to wake up one day and there's going to be a nuclear ballistic missile test?
I mean, I expect that we're going to see a nuclear device tested sometime in the next 5 years, 7 years. I don't know that is foremost on their minds right now. They want to weaken Israel, because Israel is the primary threat to the nuclear program and the primary threat to Iran in general. They have I would say the Iranians have 5 different goals with wanting in this war. One is to elevate Hamas within the Palestinian arena over Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. Number 2 is to weaken Israel, which is the primary threat to the Iranian nuclear program and to Iran in general. Number 3, to put the Palestine question on the top of the international agenda, because that distracts attention from Iran and all of its malevolent activity, including its nuclear program. Number 4, they wanted to end all of those initiatives that were going to bring about a new Middle East. Just a little over a month ago, we were all talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization. We were talking about a new dawn in Turkish-Israeli relations. We were talking about I2U2, this trade route from India to Europe through Saudi Arabia and Israel. All that is gone, at least for the moment. Some of it won't come back. I don't know how long it will take before we're once again talking about Turkish-Israeli improved relations. I can see if Israel wins big over Hamas, I can see the Saudi-Israeli thing coming back relatively soon. But the feelings out there in the Muslim world are very hard right now, very, very hard. I can't overestimate. I mean, I can't overstate how successful Iran has been in the propaganda war, in the information war, the propaganda campaign. You see it on our own campuses and so on, but it's a lot stronger in the Muslim world. I feel like I lost my train of thought there. Did I stay on track, or was I?
You did. I think you answered about the next 3 of my questions, but you did. So let's take that. Let me just go with what you just said. I mean, one of the things that has me concerned, and I do believe that the Saudi-Israel normalization will occur when Israel comes out the strong horse, and I do feel confident, as you do, that Israel is going to come out with a win on this. But unless America stops it, the scenario. Sorry to interrupt you. No, please do. The scenario that I expect to see is that once Israel has, they don't want. I'm making this up, by the way. I have no information. I just have a sense of how these guys think.
right now Israel is effectively in control of the of the north of the Gaza Strip, of Gaza City. Obviously, there's still a lot of fighting that's going to go on there. There's lots of what Donald Trump was, or was it George W. Bush who called these ones dead enders? There are guys who are going to fight to the end on the ground in Gaza City, but the fight is lost. It's 100% lost. There's no way they do anything but do a little bit of damage to the Israelis. And the commanders, many of the commanders on the ground have been killed. The big commanders have gone south. Many of the platoon commanders, the company commanders, they're dead. So the ones that are still alive are demoralized. I'm sure I can't think of anything worse than to be sitting in a tunnel with a bunch of wounded guys groaning around me and not knowing where to go and what to do. The Israelis, there's going to be a great story. There's going to be an awesome story that's going to be told about how the Israelis foiled this tunnel system, which I was really worried about before they went in because I didn't know any of the plans. And we still don't know how they did it, but somehow they cut off the command and control from the guys in the tunnel, clearly. So some of them get out with an RPG and find a tank and shoot it, but there's no master control. There's no strategic control of the forces in the North Gaza Strip. So when that ends, and they took Shifa Hospital today, or they're taking it while we're talking, the Americans are going to come in and try to shut it down and keep the Israelis from going to Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is the hometown of Yahya Sinwar, and it's got tunnels under it, and I assume that that's where most of the hostages are. The Israelis have bombed Khan Yunis very lightly, and that tells me, I could be wrong. Again, I don't have any information, but that tells me that the hostages are there in Khan Yunis. And so what they or at least most of them are, and pardon me, so the Israelis are going to have to go in to Khan Yunis. And Defense Minister Gallant said yesterday or today, I can't remember when I read it, that we're going to go in to Khan Yunis. I bet you in the White House they're saying we got to stop that. So they want to say, call it a victory. This, all these images of victory that the Israelis have, blowing up the legislative assembly and taking Shifa Hospital, taking Shati refugee camp, all of this. Let's call that a victory, and then start rebuilding. It's not enough. They got to go all the way to Khan Yunis, and so we have to argue that. And if the Americans,
don't you think that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but don't you think this is different this time? I mean, as much pressure as the U.S. and the international community is going to be, is already putting on Israel to call for humanitarian pause, ceasefire. Israel can't do that. You've pointed that out. I mean, if people are going to go back to their homes, how is anybody going to go back to living in the South or living in the North if these terrorist organizations survive?
Do you think Golda Meir didn't want to destroy the Egyptian Third Army in 1973? The United States can be very persuasive when it wants to be. I'll give you a scenario. Without announcing it, they just stopped supplying ammunition to the Israelis. And at the same time, Hezbollah and Iran get wind of the distance between Israel and the United States, and Hezbollah starts, Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, called up Gallant on Friday or Saturday and said, hey, you guys are being too rough with Hezbollah up there in the north. And the next day, Hezbollah let Hamas shoot rockets to the outskirts of Haifa, which was a complete, there's this little dance that Hezbollah and Israel do where they keep all of the conflict within 5 kilometers either side of the border, and that was a rule that those rockets going to Haifa or went to the Krayot, just north of Haifa. Those broke the rules, right? When did they break the rules? They broke the rules right after the Americans said, "Oh, Israel, you have to be more restrained." So America starts withholding resupply, makes some public statements of concern, floats a hostage together with the Iranians and the Qataris, and floats a hostage exchange of some sort that's not, outrageous, that will split the whole the coalition in Israel. And then Hezbollah turns up the heat a little bit. I mean, what are you going to do then if you're Israel? That's a real tough one. If the United States really wants to put the screws to you, it has lots of ways to do it, and others will help it, believe me.
There's a lot of questions in the queue, but I just want to ask you quickly. I'm concerned by the Chinese mediated Saudi-Iranian détente. And then, last week we looked at pictures of Mohammed bin Salman with Abraham Raisi, which I found a bit unnerving. I mean, the culmination of last week's meeting between the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation didn't end with any of Iran's requests.
That was actually quite they can have all the photo ops together they want. The Iranians made a bunch of demands, and they all said, "What time is it? Who? When?" So,
are the Saudis hedging their bets at all?
Yeah, sure. In the sense, just like they did with, I think the Saudis have made it very clear to everyone what they want. They want to revitalize the American security system. They're happy within that context to normalize with Israel. I don't think their policy has changed that much since this thing broke out. Every Muslim in the world, I'm exaggerating, of course, but the vast majority of Muslims in the world sympathize with the plight of the Palestinians, think that Israel's policy is excessive and cruel, and that's just a fact of life. Every Arab leader has to deal with that on one level or another. I don't think the Saudis are any different. So we're going to see some movement during this period of crisis. I don't see any kind of strategic shift on the part of the Saudis yet. The thing that's going to, but if the United States doesn't allow Israel to finish the job, and get rid of this horrible organization, then I think we'll see more of what you mentioned, which is the hedging toward Iran and China.
So bringing the Palestinians into this, you actually retweeted several days ago an article from one of your Hudson colleagues, Mohammed Ali Yahya.
Yeah.
And in that he was proposing to bring back the Saudi initiative, which was known as the Arab Peace Initiative, which is, I think it's like 20 years old, but it was always, it was never taken seriously. But he's suggesting that they bring it back now. And what I'm finding confusing is why people are actually even talking about the possibility of a two-state solution at this point, no matter what plan you use. It seems to me that the new reality created after October 7th is there's zero chance that Israel would ever cede any land to Palestinians. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you. I don't think I don't think the world has quite absorbed yet what has happened in Israel. One of the things that they haven't absorbed is all of those. I've forgotten. I can't remember numbers. How many people were slaughtered in the Nova Trance dance festival?
240, 260.
So that's 260 secular Israelis, many of whom were the sons and daughters of the secular Tel Aviv elite, and the sense of betrayal by secular left, the sense of being betrayed by secular left-wing Israelis, by the sense that there's no partner on the other side, it is palpable. I mean, I still have, I've moved to the right over the years, but I still have a lot of left-wing Israeli friends. and they are as convinced as anyone on the right that there's no partner on the other side. So I I just don't see any Israeli government. This is a democracy, and they have to go to the voting booth. And I can't imagine any Israeli government saying, I want to put the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, I want to put him in charge of Gaza after this. That's not going to happen.
So I'm going to turn to the questions, and somebody did ask, okay, so we get rid of Hamas, who's going to replace Hamas? I mean, I've heard, yeah, I don't think anybody knows.
I have no, I have no great insight. I'm listening to the Israelis, and now there might be a role there for the Saudis to play. I agree with Mohammed in that. I don't know if they want to play it, but if they want to play a role, someone's going to have to rebuild Gaza. But I think the Israelis have already made it pretty clear, if you listen to what they're saying, that they are going to retain security control over the entire Gaza Strip indefinitely. That doesn't mean ruling it, but it means they're going to go in and out with heavy force, with an offense dominant regime that they establish and hold on to. So if rockets and missiles start coming in, boom, they're going to be in there like gangbusters. And what's on the other side? They're saying right now, we'll see how it evolves. They don't care. Like, not their attitude is going to be, you can have a communist regime here, you can have a liberal democracy, you can have an Islamic caliphate, for all I care. But if there are rockets and missiles coming at us, or you are organizing to carry out terror attacks against us, then we're going to be in there cleaning you out. That's what I hear. And what else can they say? That's, I think, a kind of sensible answer to all this.
Yeah. So a number of people are wondering why the U.S. doesn't see Israel as a strategic asset the way predecessors have, other than Obama. And people are asking, is it because they view Iran not as an adversary, but as a strategic partner in running the Middle East? I mean, we held a whole webinar with you. We had Tony on talking about the realignment, but if maybe you can address.
Yeah, Tony and I are intellectual brothers on this. I would say, wait, so forgive me, can we reset the question? Is the question, why do they hold on to this policy, or why do they like it in the first place? Or,
and why don't they view Israel as a strategic asset instead of elevating Iran?
So their policy is an answer to the question of it came out of the preference came out of the debate over the Iraq War, and they strongly believed that this investment of time and energy of the United States into the Middle East was a huge mistake. All the regime change, reshaping of the Middle East ideas of the Bush administration were a pie in the sky mistake. The United States needs to pull back, focus more on East Asia. So there are two scenarios about how you pull back. You either put together a coalition where Israel's an asset, and you try to contain the worst actors that want to damage the United States, mainly Russia, China, Iran, especially Iran. You offer your allies a defensive shield, and then you build up offensive capabilities to keep the Iranians in check. They don't want to do that because they believe that in terms of their national security doctrine, they believe that Israel and Saudi Arabia especially are kind of acting as a catapult that is throwing the United States into conflict with Iran. And that if the United States distances itself from Saudi Arabia and Israel and negotiates directly more with Iran, it will find all kinds of arenas in which Iranian and American interests intersect and overlap, despite the fact that Iran preaches hatred of America all the time openly. The idea that Iran is a natural ally of the United States, and that a less ideological foreign policy, a policy less tied to Israel and Saudi Arabia, will deliver great benefits by negotiating with Iran. That exists on both the left and the right of the political spectrum, but it's especially prominent on the left these days. So they believe this. It also makes great sense as domestic politics. And I think you can see this more clearly now. A lot of people, I've been saying this for years now, and it's been obvious to me because I used to work in a university. And so I know how the beautiful people think. And I know what a big role the beautiful people play in the Democratic Party and in the higher ranks of the Democratic Party. And so to a pro-Israel audience, it sounds ridiculous that anyone would really, find these ideas attractive, but they do. They don't like Israel. This national security doctrine that says if we pull away from Israel and work with Iran, that will stabilize the region. That then has this great, does this fantastic thing in domestic American politics of making all of the people whom the progressives hate anyway into the cause of all the conflict in the Middle East. So it's Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, evangelical Christians, Zionists like yourself, national security, minded Republicans like me. All of them, we are the party of war. And then Iran is not the party of peace, but it's the object of peaceful diplomacy. And that has a kind of automatically beneficial. On top of all this, there's a kind of intellectual hubris. These guys really think this is clever. They think it's clever. And all you have to do is look at the latest latest edition of Foreign Affairs. Jake Sullivan wrote an article in there bragging about all the peace and stability that this policy has brought to the Middle East. He wrote it went to print just before October 7th. Online, if you go on the Foreign Affairs version online now, they have edited it to account for the fact that the shelf life of that the shelf life of that confidence in the policy was very short.
You know what? There's also a video of him stating that. A lot of people haven't seen it, but if you go onto YouTube.
Oh yeah, The Atlantic with Jeffrey Goldberg. All right, who elicits all of this from? This is his job to elicit all this from Barack Obama and Jake Sullivan.
Right. I'm going to throw in one last question, because a number of people are asking, how do we define a win? If we don't get the hostages out, is that a win? If we destroy all the infrastructure, but we've only killed 10 to 20% of the Hamas fighters, is that a win? What's a win?
An acceptable win is, kind of B plus win. A minus, B plus is A minus with grade inflation is Hamas totally destroyed in the Gaza Strip, north and south. Destroyed as a military organization and destroyed as a viable political organization. And the rules of engagement in the north between Hezbollah and Israel back so that Hezbollah is deterred. Doesn't mean there has to be a full-blown war, but there's going to have to be some bloodletting, I think, in order for Hezbollah to know that it has to sit down and shut up. Or else pay a very heavy price. The Israelis have to show that they're willing to go on much more on the offensive. That's acceptable, and whatever however, if Israel takes over the whole Gaza Strip, I assume it will either I assume it will get almost all of the hostages back. I'm not sure they will all be alive, but they will get all of them back. A C- outcome is that somewhere in this process toward what I just described, the Americans shut it down. We don't have Hezbollah deterred, and Hamas is not finished as a fighting force. And the United States wraps Israel into interminable hostage release negotiations, and giving a drip hostage to today. Today we get the ties. Tomorrow we get the Americans. Oh, we have a Belgian. All of this, which is the kind of thing that the Iranians love to do, and they make you pay for each one. An A+ answer to this, which I don't think is going to happen, is we have Hamas destroyed, Hezbollah deterred, and Iran deterred. But I think that will probably have to wait for another administration for all the reasons that we've just been saying.
And it will also have to wait for another webinar, because we could talk about that, I'm sure, for the next hour. Michael, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Mike's essay I just put into the chat a couple minutes ago. You can find it either at hudson.org, where all of Mike's amazing work is posted, or it was also published in Mosaic Magazine. I also want to remind everybody that Emmett's annual gala is December 5th at the Grand Hyatt in Washington. I hope to see you all there. You can register at emmettonline.org. And I thank you all for joining. Mike, I can't thank you enough. I'm sure everybody watching learned so much, and I hope you all share the recording far and wide, because I think this was very important. So I again, thanks to everybody for joining, and to you, Mike, in particular.
Thank you. Take care.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.